The airport was buzzing with the usual chaos. Passengers hurrying to their gates, flight announcements echoing through the terminal, and the rhythmic sound of rolling suitcases blending into the background noise. Among the crowd, two young siblings, Malik and Maya, stood near their gate, holding their boarding passes tightly. They were excited. This wasn't just any flight. It was their first time flying alone, a trip their father had carefully planned for them. He had made sure everything was set, ensuring they'd be comfortable. But the moment they stepped onto the plane, something felt off. The flight attendant, a tall woman with a stiff posture and an air of authority, looked them up and down as if they didn't belong. Her name tag read, Ms. Carter. She barely glanced at their tickets before crossing her arms. "Are you sure you're on the right flight?" she asked, her tone sharp. Malik, the older of the two at 16, nodded confidently. "Yes, ma'am. We're in seats 3A and 3B. Ms. Carter's eyes narrowed. "First class." She looked at their clothes, comfortable but not designer, their backpacks slightly worn from years of school use. Something about them seemed to bother her. "I need to check with the desk," she said, snatching the tickets from Malik's hand. Maya, only 10 years old, clutched her brother's arm. "Malik, what's wrong?" she whispered. "Nothing," he reassured her, but even he felt uneasy. They had flown many times before, always with their dad or one of his assistants. This was their first time flying alone, but that shouldn't have mattered. Ms. Carter returned, her expression colder than before. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you board. You need to step aside." Malik frowned. "What? Why?" "I don't have to explain myself," she snapped. "Step off the plane now." Passengers in first class glanced over, some with curiosity, others pretending not to notice. But Malik could feel the weight of their stares. Maya's grip on his arm tightened. He took a deep breath. "Can we at least call our dad?" "There's no need for that," Ms. Carter said dismissively. "You're not supposed to be here. Either step off voluntarily, or I'll have security escort you out." Maya's eyes welled with tears. "We didn't do anything wrong." Ms. Carter sighed impatiently. "I don't have time for this." She waved over another crew member and gestured toward the exit. Defeated, Malik grabbed their bags. He didn't want to cause a scene, not in front of his little sister. As they stepped off the plane, humiliated and confused, Malik pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Dad." His voice was tight with frustration. "They kicked us off the flight." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then, in a calm but serious voice, their father asked, "Which airline was it?" Malik hesitated, unsure why that mattered. But then he glanced up at the massive logo on the wall and swallowed hard. "It's ours, Dad," he finally said. "They kicked us off our own airline." And with that, everything was about to change. Malik gripped his phone tightly as he and Maya stood just outside the gate, their bags at their feet. His father's silence on the other end of the call stretched on for a few long seconds. Malik knew that silence well. It wasn't anger, at least not the loud kind. It was the quiet, controlled kind, the kind that meant something was about to happen. "Where are you now?" their father finally asked. Malik looked around. "Near gate 12. They just kicked us off." "I'll handle it," his father said. "Stay put." The call ended. Malik exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm for Maya's sake. She was staring up at him, eyes full of confusion. "Are we going home?" she asked softly. "No," he said, forcing a small smile. "Dad's gonna fix it." Maya nodded, trusting him. She always did. But Malik couldn't shake the frustration boiling inside him. Why had that flight attendant treated them like that? They had done nothing wrong. They had their tickets, their seats. Everything was in order. But the way she had looked at them, the way she had dismissed them, it wasn't just a mistake. It was something else. Passengers continued boarding the flight in the background, walking past them as if nothing had happened. Some of them had seen what went down, but no one spoke up. No one questioned it. Malik clenched his jaw. This wasn't the first time he had experienced something like this, but it was the first time it had felt this personal. This airline, this entire business, was his father's. It was their family's legacy. And yet, here they were, standing on the outside like they didn't belong. A few minutes passed. Then, Malik noticed a man in a suit walking briskly toward them. He recognized him instantly. Mr. Peterson, one of his father's top executives. His father must have called him. Malik. Maya. Mr. Peterson's voice was smooth but serious. Are you both okay? We're fine, Malik said. Just confused. Mr. Peterson nodded, then turned his gaze toward the jet bridge where the flight was still boarding. He didn't say anything for a moment, but his expression tightened. Malik could tell he wasn't happy. What exactly happened? Mr. Peterson asked. Malik quickly explained everything. How Ms. Carter had looked at them, how she had barely checked their tickets, how she had refused to give them a reason before kicking them off. Mr. Peterson listened carefully, then sighed. That's unacceptable. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number. Malik couldn't hear what was said, but he caught a few words, grounded and review immediately. Maya tugged at Malik's sleeve. Are we getting back on the plane? She asked. Before he could answer, there was movement near the gate. Ms. Carter had stepped out of the jet bridge, talking to another flight attendant. When she noticed them still standing there, her lips pressed into a thin line. What are they still doing here? She muttered, clearly not expecting them to still be around. Mr. Peterson turned to face her. Ms. Carter, he said, his voice firm. Would you care to explain why these two passengers were removed from the flight? Ms. Carter blinked, caught off guard. But then she quickly straightened, her usual stern expression returning. They weren't on the passenger list. That's incorrect, Mr. Peterson replied. I personally verified their booking. Ms. Carter hesitated for half a second before folding her arms. Well, there must have been a mistake in the system. A mistake that only affected them? Mr. Peterson's tone was sharp now. Why didn't you verify before making them leave? Ms. Carter shifted uncomfortably. I was following procedure. What procedure? Mr. Peterson asked. Because as far as I'm aware, our procedure is to verify before removing passengers, not after. Ms. Carter opened her mouth, then closed it again. She glanced around, realizing that more people were watching now. Malik could see it in her face. She was realizing she had messed up. But instead of apologizing, she simply stiffened. If there was a mistake, I'll take it up with the airline, she said. But right now I have a flight to board. Mr. Peterson stared at her for a long moment. Then, he pulled out his phone again and spoke quietly into it. A few seconds later, the gate agent's radio crackled. Flight 289, hold boarding immediately, a voice said over the intercom. Passengers near the gate started looking around in confusion. The flight attendants exchanged glances. Even Ms. Carter's confident stance faltered. What's going on? She asked. Mr. Peterson's voice was calm but firm. We're going to sort this out before that plane goes anywhere. Maya looked up at Malik. Does that mean we can go back on? Malik wasn't sure. But one thing was clear. His father wasn't going to let this slide. And neither was he. The murmurs in the terminal grew louder as the announcement about the flight delay spread through the crowd. Passengers who had already boarded were now peeking out from the jet bridge, while those still waiting at the gate checked their phones, trying to figure out what was happening. Ms. Carter's expression darkened. She had started this, assuming it would be a minor inconvenience that would be over in minutes. But now, with Mr. Peterson involved, with the flight held back, and with all eyes on her, she was realizing this wasn't going to be brushed aside. I don't understand the holdup, she said, her voice clipped. We have a full flight and a schedule to keep. Mr. Peterson remained calm. And we also have policies against unjustly removing passengers. His tone was controlled, but there was a warning in his eyes. Malik held his breath as he watched the exchange. Maya was still gripping his sleeve, her small fingers curled tightly into the fabric. She had stopped asking questions, but he could feel the tension in her posture. She just wanted to get on the plane. So did he. Before Ms. Carter could respond, another voice cut through the commotion. A deeper, more commanding voice. Ms. Carter. Everyone turned. A tall man in a crisp navy suit was walking toward them, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with each step. His presence alone seemed to shift the atmosphere. Employees straightened their backs, and even Mr. Peterson gave a respectful nod. Malik swallowed. It was his father, the CEO of the airline. For a brief second, he felt relief. His father was here. He would make things right. But he also knew that when his father was this quiet, this composed, someone was about to face serious consequences. Ms. Carter's confident stance wavered as recognition dawned on her. She glanced at Mr. Peterson, then at Malik and Maya, then back at the man now standing in front of her. "Sir," she said quickly, shifting to a more professional tone. "I wasn't aware." "You weren't aware of what, exactly?" Malik's father interrupted. His voice was even, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. "That my children were booked on this flight? Or that you removed them without cause?" Ms. Carter hesitated. "There was an issue with the manifest." "I checked the manifest myself," he replied. "Their names were there. So I'll ask again, why did you remove them?" A bead of sweat formed at Ms. Carter's temple. She looked like she was scrambling for the right words. Malik almost felt bad for her. Almost. "There was confusion with their booking," she said finally. "That's not what I was told," his father said. He turned to Mr. Peterson. "Did she verify their booking before making them leave?" Mr. Peterson shook his head. "No, sir. She acted on assumption." His father's jaw tensed slightly. "Assumption," he repeated. Silence fell over the gate. Employees were watching, some barely disguising their curiosity. Passengers nearby had paused their conversations, their attention now fully on the scene unfolding in front of them. Ms. Carter took a small step back. "Sir, I was only following protocol." "No," his father corrected. "You weren't." He exhaled slowly, then added, "I expect my employees to act with professionalism and fairness. You didn't do that today." Malik noticed how her breathing quickened, her fingers twitching slightly. She wasn't sure what to say. Maya, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke, her voice small but firm. "She didn't even let us talk. She just told us to leave." The way she said it, so simple, so honest, only made the weight of the situation heavier. Ms. Carter opened her mouth as if to defend herself, but she must have realized there was nothing she could say to fix this. Mr. Peterson leaned in slightly. "Sir, what would you like us to do?" Malik's father didn't answer right away. He looked at his children first, his expression softening just slightly. Then, he straightened and turned to Ms. Carter. "For now, I need a new flight attendant to take over for this route," he said. His voice wasn't angry, but there was a finality to it. "Escort her off duty." Ms. Carter's eyes widened. "Sir." "We'll discuss your employment status later," he added, leaving no room for argument. Two airline supervisors, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. Ms. Carter stiffened, her face pale. She hesitated as if she wanted to fight it, but she knew she couldn't. Without another word, she turned sharply and walked away with the supervisors, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor. The moment she was gone, Mr. Peterson nodded toward the gate agent. "Resume boarding. And make sure these two get to their seats immediately." Malik let out a breath he didn't even realize he had been holding. Maya was still staring up at their father, her grip loosening now that she could tell things were settling down. Their father crouched slightly to her level. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" She nodded, though she still looked shaken. "I didn't like how she talked to us," she admitted quietly. His father sighed, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You shouldn't have had to deal with that. Neither of you should have." He glanced at Malik then. "You handled it well." Malik nodded, though he wasn't sure how he felt. He was glad they were getting back on the plane, but a part of him was still frustrated. What if their father hadn't intervened? What if they had just gone home, humiliated and ignored? His father must have sensed his thoughts. He placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Situations like this," he said in a low voice, "show people's true colors." Malik understood what he meant. Ms. Carter had made her decision before even knowing who they were. She hadn't expected consequences. As the gate agent motioned for them to board, Malik and Maya picked up their bags. They walked toward the jet bridge, but before stepping inside, Malik glanced back. Their father was still watching, standing tall, composed. But there was something in his eyes. A silent promise. This wasn't over yet. Malik and Maya stepped back onto the plane, their hearts still pounding from everything that had just happened. The other flight attendants were noticeably different now. More polite, more attentive. One of them even offered Maya a small packet of cookies as she led them to their seats in first class. Malik felt the weight of the moment settle over him as he sank into his seat. Everything had shifted so quickly. Just minutes ago, they had been forced off this very plane, treated like they didn't belong. Now, the atmosphere had changed, but that didn't erase what had happened. He stole a glance at Maya, who was quietly nibbling on the cookies, her small legs swinging slightly beneath her seat. She seemed calmer, but he could tell she was still thinking about it. The murmurs of passengers drifted through the cabin. Some people were pretending not to notice them, while others were openly staring. He caught snippets of whispered conversations. "That's them, the kids who got kicked off. I heard their dad owns the airline. That flight attendant got taken off duty." Malik clenched his fists. He wasn't sure what irritated him more, the fact that people were only treating them differently now because of who their father was, or the fact that no one had spoken up earlier when it mattered. The engines roared to life as the plane began taxiing toward the runway. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, but Malik noticed something. There was tension in their movements. They were nervous. The flight delay, the unexpected change in staff, and the lingering whispers had thrown everything off balance. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We're cleared for takeoff and will be in the air shortly." Maya leaned toward Malik. "Are you still mad?" she asked, her voice quiet. He hesitated before answering. "I don't know. I keep thinking about what would have happened if Dad hadn't shown up." Maya thought for a moment, then nodded. "Me too." The plane lifted off, the ground disappearing beneath them. Malik stared out the window, watching the city shrink below. The tension in his chest wasn't going away. A few minutes into the flight, a different flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes and a soft voice, approached them. "Can I get you anything? Water? Juice?" Maya asked for apple juice. Malik just shook his head. The flight attendant hesitated. "If you need anything at all, just let me know." As she walked away, Malik turned to Maya. "You see how nice everyone is now?" Maya frowned. "Yeah. They weren't like that before." She thought about it, then nodded slowly. "Because they didn't know who we were." Malik sighed. "Yeah." He tried to relax, but something still didn't feel right. And then, just as he was starting to push the thoughts away, something happened that made his stomach drop. A voice, low, angry, cut through the murmurs of the cabin. "This is ridiculous. That flight attendant didn't do anything wrong. Malik turned his head sharply. A man sitting a few rows behind them was shaking his head, talking loudly to the woman beside him. His voice wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but it carried through the cabin. She got taken off the flight just for doing her job, he continued. This is what happens when people abuse their power. The woman next to him murmured something, but the man wasn't done. He shifted in his seat, leaning slightly forward. You know what this is? This is favoritism. Because of who their daddy is, they get special treatment. Malik felt a prickle of heat rise to his face. He could feel other passengers glancing between them and the man. Maya shrank in her seat. The man shook his head again, muttering under his breath. Unbelievable. Malik's pulse pounded in his ears. He wasn't sure if it was anger or something else, but his hands gripped the armrests. He could ignore it. He could pretend he didn't hear. But then the man scoffed loudly. Some of us actually work for what we have. Malik turned in his seat before he could stop himself. He met the man's gaze directly. Excuse me? The man raised an eyebrow, like he hadn't expected Malik to respond. You heard me. Malik's voice was steady, but his fingers were tense against the seat. We didn't do anything wrong. The man smirked slightly. Maybe. But you still got a flight attendant removed just because she didn't bow down to you. Malik clenched his jaw. He wanted to tell this man everything. How unfairly they had been treated, how they had been humiliated, how no one had cared until they realized who they were. But before he could say another word, a calm but firm voice interrupted. I think that's enough. The flight attendant from earlier had returned. She stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her, but there was a quiet authority in her posture. The man rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. No, the flight attendant said. You're saying what you think, and you're making other passengers uncomfortable. The man exhaled sharply, then threw up his hands. Whatever. He slumped back in his seat, muttering under his breath. Malik turned back around, his heart still hammering. He felt Maya tuck her hand into his. He gave it a small squeeze. The tension in the cabin didn't disappear. If anything, it only thickened. Malik knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Malik tried to focus on the hum of the plane, the steady rhythm of the engines, anything to block out the uneasy feeling still settling in his chest. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Even though the flight attendant had put a stop to the man's comments, the tension hadn't disappeared. It lingered, thick and unspoken. Maya shifted beside him, curling up in her seat. She wasn't saying much now, but Malik could tell she was still thinking about what had happened. Her fingers were fidgeting with the edge of her sweater, something she did when she was nervous. He exhaled and glanced toward the front of the cabin. The flight attendant who had stood up for them was still there, speaking in hushed tones with another crew member. She looked calm, but something in her body language felt off, like she was trying to keep her composure. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Malik noticed a different kind of movement. A flight attendant, one he hadn't seen before, was walking toward them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp, unreadable eyes. There was something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, that made Malik sit up straighter. The attendant stopped near Malik and Maya's row, glancing at them briefly before looking at the other passengers. His voice, deep and controlled, carried through the quiet cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your cooperation. Unfortunately, due to an unexpected issue, we'll need to conduct a secondary check of some passenger details. A murmur rippled through the first-class section. People exchanged confused looks. Malik frowned. What kind of secondary check were they talking about? They were already in the air. Wasn't everything supposed to be sorted before takeoff? The flight attendant's gaze flickered back toward them. His eyes settled on Malik and Maya. "We'll need to verify a few names on the manifest," he said. "Starting with you two." Malik felt his stomach drop. Maya blinked up at him, confused. "Why?" The flight attendant didn't answer right away. He pulled out a small tablet, tapping the screen. "Just standard protocol." Malik knew that wasn't true. There was nothing standard about any of this. They had already been removed from the plane once. Now they were being singled out again? His mind raced. Was this connected to what had happened earlier? Or was this something else entirely? He glanced around the cabin, noticing the way some passengers were looking away, pretending not to notice. Others were watching carefully, their expressions guarded. Mr. Peterson, the senior airline representative who had intervened before, was nowhere in sight. Malik took a slow breath. "We already went through check-in. Our names were on the manifest before takeoff." The flight attendant's lips pressed together, like he was expecting resistance. "We just need to confirm." Maya shifted uncomfortably. "But we didn't do anything." The flight attendant's expression didn't change. "This will only take a moment." Malik's hands curled into fists. He didn't want to make a scene. Not again. But something about this felt wrong. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Before he could respond, another voice, steady and authoritative, spoke from behind them. "That won't be necessary." Malik turned. His father stood in the aisle. He hadn't expected him to be on board. He had assumed their father would have stayed back at the airport, dealing with the aftermath of what had happened. But here he was, standing tall, his expression unreadable. The flight attendant's face twitched slightly. "Sir, this is a routine." "No," his father interrupted. "It's not." His voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. Passengers were watching now, sensing that something bigger was happening. The flight attendant hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit as if waiting for backup. But no one came. "I suggest you step away from my children," Malik's father continued, his voice quiet but heavy with authority. The flight attendant's jaw tightened. For a moment, it looked like he might push back. But then, with a short nod, he tucked the tablet against his chest and turned, walking briskly back toward the galley. Malik exhaled, barely realizing he had been holding his breath. His father took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Malik and Maya could hear. "Are you both okay?" Maya nodded quickly, but Malik still felt uneasy. "Dad, what's going on?" His father didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the cabin, scanning the faces of the passengers, the crew, the lingering tension in the air. Then he leaned down slightly, his voice quieter now. "There's something bigger happening here." Malik felt a chill crawl up his spine. Bigger? Bigger than what had already happened? Before he could ask what his father meant, a sudden chime rang through the cabin. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unforeseen issue, we will be making an emergency landing at our nearest available airport. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions." Maya's hand gripped Malik's. Passengers immediately started murmuring, the anxiety in the cabin shifting into something sharper. Emergency landing? Malik exchanged a look with his father. Something was definitely wrong. And whatever it was, it wasn't over yet. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Malik's heart pounded as he exchanged a glance with his father, whose face remained unreadable. Maya clutched his hand tightly, her small fingers squeezing harder than before. The emergency landing announcement had sent a wave of uncertainty through the passengers, and the quiet murmurs had turned into full-blown whispers. Malik couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a routine issue. The way his father had intervened, the way that flight attendant had singled them out, it all felt too calculated. Something was happening behind the scenes, and they were right in the middle of it. The plane jolted slightly as the descent began. The flight attendants, now visibly tense, moved through the aisles, checking seatbelts and ensuring everyone remained seated. Malik noticed the tall flight attendant from earlier whispering something to another crew member, his expression sharp and serious. His father leaned in, speaking low. "Stay close to me. No matter what happens when we land." The weight in his words made Malik's stomach drop. "Dad, what's going on?" His father's eyes flickered toward the cockpit. "I don't think this is just about what happened earlier." Malik's pulse quickened. The plane continued its descent, and outside the window, Malik could see the faint glow of runway lights. They weren't landing at a major airport. This was a smaller airstrip, one that looked more private than commercial. The wheels hit the ground with a sharp thud, and the plane rolled down the runway before coming to a slow stop. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while we assess the situation. Thank you for your patience." The unease in the cabin was nearly suffocating. People glanced around, unsure of what was happening. Then, before anyone could ask questions, something unexpected happened. The aircraft door opened, not by the flight crew, but by a group of uniformed security personnel waiting outside. They boarded quickly, their expressions serious, their movements precise. Maya's grip on Malik's hand tightened. "Why are they here?" she whispered. Malik couldn't answer. The lead officer, a man with sharp eyes and a firm stance, stepped forward. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his gaze locking onto their father. Malik's breath caught. The entire cabin went silent. His father stood, calm as ever. "Yes." The officer nodded. "We need you to come with us." A ripple of shock moved through the passengers. Some of them had been expecting drama, but no one had expected this. Malik shot to his feet. "Why? What's going on?" The officer remained professional. "There have been allegations of misconduct within your airline. We have reason to believe that certain employees, including members of this flight's crew, have been engaging in discriminatory practices and policy violations under falsified protocols." His eyes flickered toward the tall flight attendant who had targeted them earlier. "We've been investigating for weeks. This flight confirmed our suspicions." A stunned silence filled the air. The very people who had tried to humiliate Malik and Maya were now the ones being investigated. The tall flight attendant stiffened. "I was just—" The officer cut him off. "Save it. We already have the internal reports." The weight of the moment hit Malik like a wave. This wasn't just about them. This was bigger. His father hadn't just been protecting them. He had known something was off within his own airline. And now, the truth was coming to light. Maya's voice was barely a whisper. "They were watching the whole time?" Malik exhaled slowly. "Looks like it." The flight attendants involved were escorted off first, their faces pale, their protests met with silence. Malik felt a strange mix of relief and shock. They had tried to make him and Maya feel powerless. But in the end, they were the ones who had been caught in their own web. His father turned back to him, his expression softening for the first time. "You okay?" Malik nodded slowly. "Yeah, I didn't expect this." His father placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes people think they can get away with things forever. But the truth always comes out." As they stepped off the plane and into the night air, Malik glanced back one last time. The cabin, once filled with tension and whispers, now felt like the closing of a chapter. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just an ending. It was the start of something bigger. The cool night air hit Malik's face as he stepped off the plane, his heart still racing from everything that had just unfolded. He could hear the murmurs of the passengers behind him, whispers filled with shock, confusion, and disbelief. The once confident flight attendants who had singled them out were now being escorted away, their uniforms no longer a symbol of authority but a reminder of the mistakes they had made. Maya held tightly onto their father's arm, her small frame leaning into him as if seeking comfort. Malik glanced at her, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes. It had been an overwhelming day, and though they had come out on the right side of things, it didn't change how much they had gone through. Their father remained calm, his face unreadable as he exchanged a few quiet words with one of the security officers. Though he had always been a man of power and influence, tonight had proven something else. He wasn't just a businessman. He was someone who stood up when it mattered. As they moved toward a waiting black SUV, Malik finally spoke. "Dad, did you know this was going to happen?" His father sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose before looking at him. "I suspected something was wrong," he admitted. There had been complaints, whispers of discriminatory practices, unfair treatment of certain passengers. But I didn't have solid proof. Not until today. Maya frowned. "So, when they kicked us off earlier, you knew?" "I had a feeling," their father said. "But I needed to see how far they would take it. I didn't expect them to target you two so blatantly. That's what gave me everything I needed." Malik absorbed his words. It made sense now, why their father had shown up when he did, why he had remained so composed throughout the ordeal. He wasn't just reacting. He had been watching, waiting for the right moment to act. As the SUV pulled away from the airstrip, Malik stared out the window, watching the small airport fade into the distance. His mind replayed everything, how quickly things had escalated, the humiliation of being singled out, and the satisfaction of seeing justice served. After a few moments, he turned back to his father. "What happens now?" His father's expression was firm. "There will be a full investigation. The employees responsible will face consequences. And moving forward, we're making sure this never happens again. Not just in our airline, but in the industry." Maya's eyes widened. "You mean, you're going public with this?" Their father nodded. "We have to. People need to know that these things still happen, and they need to know that there's accountability." Malik let the weight of those words settle over him. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Every person who had been treated unfairly and had no one to stand up for them. The ride continued in silence for a while, the exhaustion of the night settling in. Maya eventually leaned against Malik's shoulder, her breathing slowing as she drifted to sleep. He glanced down at her, brushing a loose curl from her face. Their father spoke again, his voice softer now. "I know today was hard. I know it wasn't fair. But I need you to understand something." Malik met his gaze. "You are never powerless," his father said. "People will try to make you feel small. They will try to take away your dignity. But as long as you know your worth, as long as you stand up for yourself and for others, you will always have power." Malik swallowed the lump in his throat. He wasn't sure he had ever truly understood that until now. By the time they arrived at their hotel, the events of the night still lingered in the air. The world outside felt quiet, as if it hadn't just witnessed everything they had been through. But Malik knew that by tomorrow, people would be talking. The story would spread, and change would come. As he tucked Maya into bed, he sat beside her for a moment, watching her sleep. She had been strong tonight, stronger than most adults would have been. He took a deep breath, letting the weight of the night settle in his chest. Then, for the first time since stepping on that plane, he felt something new. Not anger. Not frustration. Hope. Because this wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of something better.